Okay, so we're starting chapter 20, communities of organisms, or community ecology. So, wolves. This is Yellowstone National Park. Wolves were exterminated in the 20s. The park changed a lot. They were considered varmints, and so from that time on, the park changed a lot in terms of, first of all, there were lots of elk and moose and bison, and all those animals, large herbivores, were uh, growing in population size. There was no predation on any of them. And also, because those things eat plants, the plant community changed in Yellowstone as well. Okay, so um, Robert Bechta observed that Yellowstone's loss of trees in 1996, especially along riparian corridors with water. Um, Noticed bark was stripped away from the aspens, um, and he thought, well, maybe, probably the elk and stuff are eating it. So when we talk about ecological communities, we're talking about um, associations of species that live in the same area and interact with one another. That means a community includes all the organisms in that area, or let's say inside my gut. I have a bacterial community that will include bacteria, it includes fungi, probably viruses, all kinds of different things. Okay, so when we talk about some measures of community, uh, relative species abundance gives you each individual species, how much of that how many of those individuals there are in terms of a total proportion of the whole community. And then species richness is the actual number of species. So relative species abundance is the number of individuals of a given species, uh, a measure of population size and density, and species richness then is the number of different species, and then you can get a measure that incorporates these two measurements. So let's take a look at this community. Um, we've got trees, we've got grass, we've got elk. So community of plants, animals, and also there's all kinds of microorganisms living in the woodlands. So we've got mosquito larvae, probably in some water, worms, amoeba in the soil, fly larvae. So these are a community um, of single-celled, well, actually, multicellular protists. So the mosquito larva is multicellular, they're animals. Fly larva is multicellular. Amoeba is unicellular, so it's a eukaryotic single-cell organism. This worm is multicellular. And then also, living inside the elk, there's also a community of microorganisms, including there's a parasite, some bacteria, a rod-shaped bacteria, and some pneumococcal bacteria, round-shaped. So that's all part of the community that's here. So we measure. I mentioned two measures of species diversity. We have species abundance. So if we look here, actually, okay. So if we look here, we notice that there's one species that dominates the community. The community has higher relative species abundance of all the white bark trees. Okay, so let's take a look. We've got how many species of white bark trees? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay. So 14 of the white bark. And then we've got 3 of these guys. And then finally we've got 1 of these. Okay? So the community is dominated by the white bark. That means it's got high relative species abundance of one species that dominates the whole community. And the community, though, has less diversity than compared to number 2 here. So this community has high species richness. In other words, number of species. Okay, so we've actually got, okay. Got 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. 1, 2, 3. Of those, 4 of those. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. And we've got another one. Oh. Okay. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So here we've got, instead of 3 species, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 species, and they all have the same relative abundance of 4 individuals each. So this is a more diverse community, and it's not dominated by 1 species or 2 species. Okay. So relative abundance and richness had changed in Yellowstone. Many of the common inhabitants of Yellowstone had changed in relative abundance. Aspen trees and willows were in decline. Elk and coyote numbers had increased. Bison and beaver populations had decreased. This is since wolves were removed in the 20s. Species richness has also changed, though they got rid of the gray wolf. And the total number of species in the community had gone down by only 1, but the gray wolf was a keystone species. And namely, what is a keystone species? Well, a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionately large effect on the community. Why? Well, the gray wolf, what does it eat? It eats large herbivores. It eats elk. It eats moose. And those things eat a bunch of plants. And also, there's when the wolves kill those, let's say, elk, the elk increased, well, then nothing is killing them now. That's why they've kind of overtaken everything. So let's take a look. So this is another one. This is a famous experiment with Connell and looking at sea star community in the intertidal zone. So we've got a sea star is an example of a keystone species in a marine environment. Why is it a keystone species? Well, there's all these other organisms here. We've got everything from lichen or a seaweed. We've got, let's see, you can't really show it. There's crabs. There's mussels. You can't really see that. So in 1963, the sea stars were removed from one site while an adjacent site was undisturbed. This is actually Payne. And when the sea stars were removed, things happened. So let's take a look. So so they had two treatments. One was a plot where the sea star was still there. That was the placebo. And then the other were plots where the sea star was removed. And then it looked at the number of species. Okay? Well, you can see that species abundance, or species richness, for where the sea star was not removed, was high. Had about 17 or 18 species. And that's because the sea stars eliminated the mussels that otherwise would have taken over and crowded everything else out. But where the sea stars were removed, the mussels came back, so high relative species abundance of mussels only, and there were only species left over were the mussels, and all the other species went extinct from those plots. So you can see how the sea star had an exorbitant amount of effect on the community, either when it was there or when it was removed. Okay. So, wolves, no wolves, more elk, less aspen trees. So this is a food chain. Wolves eat elk. Elk eat aspen trees. So what do you think will happen if you put in wolves? Well, aspen trees will not get eaten as much, and they won't be stripped of their foliage. So what's a food chain? It's a simple list of who gets whom. In this case, we have wolves, we've got elk, and we've got aspen trees. This is a simple food web chain. But then there's something called a food web that is a lot more complex. And we'll look at that in a second. So you have a complex diagram of several food chains in a single ecosystem. And in those ecosystems, what do you have? You have producers, organisms at the bottom of the chain, but that produce most of the food, namely they're photosynthesizers. So plants on terrestrial ecosystems, or bacteria and algae in marine ecosystems. And then you have a bunch of consumers. Some consumers eat, in this case, the wolves eat these guys, and they're first consumers, so the wolves are secondary consumers, and the elk are the first primary consumers, and they eat the producers right here. Okay. So let's take a look at this. Okay. So this is a food web. We have the species in which the anero leads eats the species from which the arrow originates. So it turns out gray wolves don't actually eat coyotes, but they kill them. Gray wolves eat elk, not so much pronghorns because they can't catch them. Coyotes, mainly young pronghorn, and coyotes also eat usually young elk. And then you can see as far as the coyotes actually eat some berries, and then there's other things that are eating like rabbits and hares. The elk is eating all the plants. And the pronghorn are eating plants, and the red foxes are eating the smaller things. Okay. So if you would please go to the animation and watch this animation on the food web. If you go to chapter 20 under animations, it's about 2 minutes or 3 minutes long, and it goes into not only this is a food chain, but it also gives you a food web as well. Okay. So as I mentioned, producers are the energy base of a food chain. Usually in terrestrial ecosystems, it's plants. There are a few other things too. There's some algae, there's some lichen, but not much. So mainly plants. But in marine ecosystems, there's seaweed, there's algae, bacteria that are photosynthetic that produce. Okay, so right here in a tropical rainforest, there's an abundance of plants that store chemical energy harvested by the sunlight that are turned into carbohydrates, and trees grow and all that kind of stuff. But here's a desert. It's much sparser in terms of the plant community. First of all, there's one thing that's limiting here more than anything, and that's water. Okay, so the organisms at the bottom of the food chain use the energy from the sun to make carbohydrates for photosynthesis, and then all the other things eat those plants, and then things eat the first consumers. So in Yellowstone on land, all over the earth, photosynthetic plants are the major producers. Okay. And then there's all these consumers. Now, so the first consumers are the ones that actually eat the producers. Okay? So we've got consumers in general, organisms that obtain energy by eating all or parts of other organisms. The primary consumers, elk eat aspen. Other things like mice eat grass, seeds, and things like that. Secondary consumers, wolves eat elk. Okay. And other things. And remember, oh yeah, here's the producers at the base of the food chain. Okay. Then there's tertiary consumers. Let's say a bird eats a spider, which is a secondary consumer that ate a beetle. That is a primary consumer that ate a plant. Okay. And then for example, you could have a quaternary, like the fourth consumer. A killer whale eats a leopard seal that ate a sea bass that ate krill, which are the primary consumers. They're crustaceans that ate phytoplankton, the producers. Okay, so this is an example of community ecology, a simple food web in a short grass prairie. The numbers represent trophic levels. So the first trophic level, right here and right here, are the plants. Okay, that's the producers. The second trophic level are insect, pronghorn antelope, bison are also, so they can be anywhere from an insect is eating plants, bison are eating plants, all that. And then here is a mouse that is also eating plants, and a ground squirrel. And then finally there are consumers, secondary consumers. Here we've got a snake eating a mouse. This is a badger eating a mouse and also eating ground squirrels. Same thing with this owl eating both of those. Oh yeah, there's number 2. Okay, and then finally, we've got, this is a vulture eating. Actually, get rid of that. So this is eating grass seeds, eating consumers. Oh, this guy, number 3, is eating the bug, and this hawk is eating a chukar. And then finally, we've got the 4th, which is a buzzard that's eating all kinds of things that might be anywhere from might eat the badger that's already been dead or something like that, or the bison. Okay, so the numbers represent trophic levels of organisms. So the first trophic level are producers. The second trophic level are primary consumers that eat the plants. The third trophic level are the secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers. Each organism has a niche. A niche is kind of like an organism's job. There are some organisms, let's say the snake here, his job is to eat animals that it can catch, like these rodents, whether it's the ground squirrel or the rabbit or the mouse. Okay, there's also a wolf here. I didn't see that initially. So this wolf is eating bison and things like that, or is that a coyote? I don't know. Anyway, so a niche is an organism's place in the environment, including the habitat it lives in and the adaptations to utilize the resources and kind of its job. So your job are students. My job is the teacher. It turns out we're both part of the same community. Of course, I'm not eating you, I'm teaching you. Hopefully, you're learning something. Okay, so today, wolves were reintroduced in the 90s. And some ranchers were a little upset about that. But they were released from Canada. Some wolves were taken from Canada to the parts of Yellowstone and released into the park. And the wolves reproduced and they started eating things. Mainly, they were eating elk, some deer, some moose, but mainly elk. And we can actually see what happened with the number of wolves. They reproduced up to about 170. Lived in and around Yellowstone in 2007. Today there's an estimate of about 528. That's a lot. But that's in the greater area. And then finally, the population of elk went down. Instead of eating themselves at a house and home, they're now getting eaten by wolves and they're below carrying capacity. And then in January 2016, there's about 100 wolves in 10 packs living within the park, and then lots of wolves living outside the park. Okay. So, just so you know, wolves started coming down from Canada into the park in the 1980s, but they didn't really establish themselves. And then, why did it take a few years after the reintroduction of wolves for the aspen population to increase? Well, there were less elk eating all the aspen, and then beavers and bears came back. Bears eat all kinds of stuff, and beavers obviously eat the aspen as well. Okay, so how do species interact? Well, there's predation, and that includes primary consumers eating plants. So those are herbivores, but that's an example of predation. Is that it's an animal eating a plant. There's also something called a mutualism, where both species benefit from it. And so think about pollinators and plants with flowers that need pollination services. The plants produce nectar for the insects that drink, and then the insects get covered in pollen, go to another flower and pollinate the flower. There's also something called commensalism, where one species benefits, the other is not really affected very much at all. Predation. Two species interact, one benefits, this is a plus, and one is harmed. And then competition, and competition can be anything from plus, minus, or it can also be minus, where they both actually harm each other. Okay, so let's take a look. So types of social acts. So here's a donor and here's a recipient. So let's first go to selfishness down here. This donor, he eats the acorn. The recipient gets none. This is kind of like competition, right? So the recipient gets the short end of the stick right here, and the first guy gets the acorn right here. Okay. Now, you can also have a situation where you have cooperation. In this case, perhaps they're communally nesting and they share food. Okay? So in this case, we've got, we'll say this and this. Okay. Okay. So, and then finally, we've got something called altruism. This is where the donor right here, I'll take care of some of these things out of the way. So this squirrel right here, what does he do? He actually brings the acorn and feeds it to the recipient. Why would he do that? Well, maybe the recipient is related to him and they share the same genes. Okay? So in this case, this guy gets less by giving up something. Oh, hold on. Less by giving up, and this guy plus gets that. And then let's say they both harm each other. They're both competing, and they both end up worse off. And that's something called spite. Not very common. Okay, so here's a mutualism. And this is a mutualism not between these fish, but between the fish and the sea anemones. Sea anemones are animals. They're obviously invertebrates. The clownfish gain protection from predators by hiding within the sea anemones because they actually release chemicals, and they're immune, so they don't get stung by the tentacles. The clownfish is not harmed because of thick mucus covering its body. The anemone is protected from grazing predators like other fish that come along that might be trying to eat the anemone, and it also absorbs the clownfish's nutrient-rich excrement. In other words, their poop and pee. Okay? So they're both actually benefiting from this interaction. And so this is an example of plus. Okay? Both sides are getting benefits. Okay. Here's commensalism. Okay, so what's commensalism? This is a situation where there's barnacles living on the whale. The whale is not harmed by this, so instead of a plus or a minus, we'll give it a 0. Okay? So, and the barnacles get a plus. Okay. So that's commensalism. And then in terms of predators, there's all kinds of predators. A parasite is a kind of predator that lives in or on an organism and harms it. And in other words, there's a host that is infected with a parasite. That includes pathogens like COVID-19 that's now causing a pandemic. So parasites harm hosts. In other words, the parasites they get a plus, and let's say the host is a human, right? That's infecting, and so the host gets a minus. Same thing, it's just like a wolf eating an elk. Same sort of actually the same thing, but in this case, with parasites and pathogens, a lot of times they're smaller and they may live inside the host. Herbivores, animals that eat plants, okay, including animals that eat seeds. Finally, animals that eat other animals, kill other animals for food, carnivores. But carnivora is a group of animals, of mammals, of vertebrates, but there's all kinds of carnivores. There's obviously spiders are carnivores, they're eating insects. And then there are also omnivores that eat both animals and plants. We're a good example of that. We eat everything. Bears are omnivores. Mountain lions are carnivores. And then finally, scavengers, eating dead or dying plants and animals. So a vulture is eating something that's dead, so it's a scavenger. It's scavenging on dead animals. And then there's all these other things like decomposers and detritivores. So what does that mean? A decomposer, like a fungi or bacteria, they're eating, let's say they find a dead deer, and they get in there and they start digesting all that tissue, and the deer's already dead. Or you can also have worms and millipedes that are breaking things down. So there's actually a lot of times you'll see a carcass, and not only will it have all kinds of bacteria and fungi breaking it down and getting nutrients from it, but it'll also have beetles. They're called domestics or mastids, and they actually feed on the flesh. And then worms and millipedes, they're feeding on dead, let's say, dead plants. Okay. So, and then, of course, you can also end up with a predator. Where a predator, normally, it's a secondary consumer, right? In this case, it's eating this African hare, right? But here's a tsetse fly that is in fact eating the cheetah, lands on it and bites it and gets this blood. And even more so, so the tsetse fly is getting, or it's a louse fly, is sucking the blood of the cheetah, but the cheetah also, and let's see, those are the carnivores. Okay, but some of them that like tsetse flies, they actually carry, or mosquito, they carry malaria. So that's like a pathogen or kind of like a predator. So mosquito, it lands on a human and gets the blood, gets a benefit from that at our expense, and then we get infected with a malaria parasite. Okay. Now, there's all kinds of things that animals or plants, all kinds of things that actually, some of them give warnings that you don't want to mess with me. Okay. And these are adaptive responses between predators and prey. And a good example is warning coloration. Okay. Bright colors like monarch butterflies or this poison dart frog that stand out are saying, hey, if you chew on me, you're going to get really sick or you might die. There's other ways to warn that I'm dangerous, that you want to stay away from me. Can you think of one? Like rattlesnakes. Instead of using color or visuals, they use a little bit of visuals, obviously, but the main thing is you hear the rattles, and then you look down and you realize, oh, there's a rattlesnake. Okay. So there's also other ways to avoid predators. Camouflage. So here we are with its long legs outstretched. This lichen mimic katydid, a relative of the cricket, sits motionless on the lichen-covered branch to escape detection. Okay? So that's camouflage. Mimicry. The viceroy butterfly on the left mimics the color of the monarch. The monarch butterfly is poisonous. It eats a plant called milk. What is it called? What is it? Oh, anyway, as a caterpillar, it eats and gets these poisons in it that it doesn't get affected by. And then when it grows into a butterfly, the butterfly stands out and it basically tells a predator, if you chew on me, you're going to get sick. Well, this viceroy butterfly right here looks a lot like it, but it's not poisonous. But because it mimics it, it gets the same benefit of not getting eaten, but without having to produce the toxin. Okay. And then finally, group defense. So I'm going to want you also to watch some videos to get an idea of these different kinds of things. Go to chapter 20. So if you go to chapter 20 under selected media, you'll see, first of all, you'll see something called moth jamming bats. And this is coevolution between predator and prey. Obviously, the bat is trying to eat the moth. And they use sonar or echolocation to actually find where the moth is. It's dark out, right? But with echolocation, they send out these very high-pitched things that you can't hear. And they see where the moth, they get an image of where the moth is and they go and grab it. But the moth has these kind of ears along its sides that can pick up echolocation, that signal. And when a bat is getting close, sending out echolocation signals, the moth gets it, and then the moth emits also high-pitched things that screw up the echolocation of the bat, and the bat can't get it. So check that out, octopus camouflage. Broad club cuttlefish, you'll see it's kind of pretty cool predation. Shorebirds on Humboldt Bay, trying to escape from a peregrine falcon. And then in terms of other kinds of behavior, New Caledonian crows that can actually think pretty abstractly. Okay, so here we go. So here's a good example of group defense. success. This is a goshawk attacking pigeons, and the pigeons all fly together, so it's more difficult. First of all, the more individuals around, the lower your chance of actually getting picked off, as well as it can be confusing when there's so many different targets. Okay? So you can see the number of pigeons in the flock and the goshawk attack success. They're very successful as there's only one pigeon. They're becoming less successful as there's 2 to 10, much less successful when there's 11 to 50, and over 50 it's like they're discombobulated. Or here we've got muskox, and they're vulnerable, let's say, to wolves, but not really so much. And they form a big circle, and oftentimes their offspring are in the center to protect them. Okay, so we talked about an ecological niche. So that's an organism's place in the environment, including its habitat that it lives in, the resources it needs to survive and reproduce, and its adaptations to utilize those resources. And it's kind of like I said, it's kind of like its job. So a predator's job is to catch prey. A lawyer's job is to defend, let's say, a criminal. A politician's job is to get everybody mad at him. A doctor is someone that's like a job. So where do you usually find doctors? Well, their normal habitat might be a hospital. I don't go into hospitals very often. Okay, and then as far as competition, it says no one benefits. Not exactly. Actually, a lot of times, so if the same species kept competing against each other, the more dominant individual might get more food. Or if it's two different species eating the same food, one species might outcompete the other. Okay? So in this case, competition between two species, they share for or fight for a limited resource, whether it's food or, let's say, a place to stay, like a nest hole that a lot of different birds might use. And they either exploit, a species competes indirectly by sharing a resource. Let's say it's the same food. Well, a coyote and a wolf, the wolf kills an elk. The coyotes are hanging back and hoping they can dart in and get a little bit of the food. Okay? So in this case, the wolves are getting, well, they did all the work, but they're also losing some of the food because of competition. And also, they're going to chase them away. That's interference competition. So let's take a look. So there's something called the competitive exclusion principle that predicts that different species that use the same resource can coexist only if one of the same species adapts to using another resource that they can switch to. Okay? So elk and bears interact through exploitive competition. They both eat berries on berry-producing shrubs. Perhaps the elk is better at it, or the bear is better at getting berries. It's not that the bear is necessarily chasing them away, but they're probably not going to feed on the same bush. But they're both eating berries. One might be eating more berries than the other. Or elk eat the leaves and branches on shrubs, resulting in a decrease in the number of berries for the grizzlies to eat. Okay? the percentage of berries in the grizzly diet went up as elk populations went down. In other words, the elk were eating a lot of berries, but because of the wolves eating the elk and reducing their population, there was more berries for the bears. Grizzlies adapted to the presence of elk by finding food sources other than berries when there were more elk around. And the absence of elk, they increased. Remember, absence of elk because they're getting eaten by wolves increased. The bears got more berries. So the bears actually, in a sense, are getting a benefit from the wolves, which are eating the elk. Okay. And then, so this is another example of exploitative competition. Two different species of wasps feed on the same source, but do not directly compete. So they're both eating the same thing. So here's this wasp, was already resident in California in 1948. It's this blue with these dots. Okay, it was found up in Santa Barbara, San Fernando Valley, down into San Diego, Long Beach, all that. And then there was this other wasp that wasn't there. It actually invaded in the 1950s. They both ate the same thing. A lot of wasps kill other insects and lay their eggs on them. And it looks like these two different wasps didn't fight each other. It was just that one was better at killing the prey than the other one and used more of it. And so the one that wasn't as good, namely Chrysomphaly, they suffered in terms of population. They were there first, but they were competitively excluded by A. lingnensis. Okay? And so by the late 50s, early 60s, there were very few of the original wasps up there. They had been excluded. Okay? So that's the exclusion principle. Now, if the other wasp could have switched to another food source, then they would have not been competing anymore and they both could have coexisted. But this didn't happen. Sometimes it does. And that's when you get something called niche differentiation, where one species starts using another food source. Exploitative, where they're both eating the same resource, but they're not interfering directly, like fighting with each other. Okay. You can also have interference competition. Here, the bear and the wolves are competing, let's say, over a carcass. The bear's a lot bigger, but there's also a lot of, and it looks like that one of the wolves didn't do so well. Not good. Anyway, so they're fighting over a carcass. This is called interference competition, where the bear is chasing or killing the wolves and is taking over the carcass. So one individually physically interferes with the other. That's different than the other. Okay. So, what is behavioral ecology? The study of the evolutionary basis for animal behavior and the causes of that behavior. So let's let's think about this. Let's say a certain trait that organism has is for reproduction. Let's say behavioral, they're displaying for each other. One animal is displaying for the other. Okay, that's obviously important in getting a mate. That's an ultimate cause. So you need a mate to reproduce. But the proximate cause is that the one displaying has, let's say, different plumage, that the one that's, let's say it's a female looking at a male, and the female says, oh, that male has such beautiful plumage, I want to mate with him. The plumage, that visual cue, is the proximate cause. Okay. There's different kinds of behaviors, and there's different kinds of, some are innate, where an individual doesn't have to learn them, and others are learned behaviors. Some behaviors are very fixed and they're stereotyped. They're always done exactly the same way, like the blue-footed boobies, whereas others are learned. So how you stereotype where there's little variation, yawning, is one of those things. No one has to teach you how to yawn. And it's innate, very little modification. Some people might be better yawners than others, but in general, we don't need to be taught how to yawn. And when we yawn, it's always the same sort of thing. It's very always the same. It's not, doesn't vary in terms of, one kind of yawn versus another. And then if you go from left to right, you go to more flexible behavior. Well, smiling, there's a certain amount of innateness in smiling, but there's different kinds of smiles, and there's different kinds of reasons for smiling. One, because you're happy about something. Another, smiling actually gives, sometimes you give a kind of a hidden smile because you think someone just said something kind of stupid. Or it looks like you're smiling maybe to diffuse something, but you're actually scared. And then finally, you go towards, if you go from top to bottom, innate on top, those are things like yawning, whereas you have other things that you learn, like language acquisition. So one of the most innate things are fixed action patterns. Yawning is a good example of that. Also, conditional strategies, you do one kind of behavior in this situation, a different kind of behavior in another situation. You have, obviously, if you're an animal, neural mechanisms and visual mechanisms for cueing that behavior, and so on. Okay, so fixed action patterns. These patterns show little variation. They don't have to learn. They do them automatically if they get the right cue, and are usually species specific. So courtship displays are usually fixed action patterns. They always display exactly the same way. One male doesn't, or they don't display properly, they don't elicit the right cue, you don't get that behavior. Web building spiders. No one can teach them how to do that. Egg retrieval behavior in these geese. That also is kind of an innate sort of thing. Conditioning and imprinting. Well, there was this famous ethologist. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. And his name was Lorenz. And he noticed that with ducks and ducklings, when the ducklings hatched, the first individual they saw was usually the female duck, and they immediately imprinted on her and followed her around. So they were ready to go, and she then led them into the water. So the ducklings are learning. They get an initial cue, they remember it, and then they follow her around no matter what. Okay, well, they did the same thing with these geese. These are, these cranes. These are whooping cranes that were very endangered. And so what they did was they started fostering whooping cranes. They would get eggs, and they would raise these birds, and then they would fly. The biologists, they were imprinted on the biologists flying this ultralight, and the biologists flew them hundreds of miles to where they needed to go to join the flock. Can animals think and plan? So this is New Caledonian crows making tools. Please look at that video on chapter 20. These are some of the smartest birds around. Not only do they make tools, but they can think abstractly. So they can use sequential tool use, and so they're very, very smart birds. Okay. Fear of snakes. How many people in here in the class are afraid of snakes? A lot of people are. A lot of people, sometimes it appears that a lot of people don't even have to be taught. They're just afraid of snakes. Well, it turns out a lot of primates are afraid of snakes, including monkeys like this macaque, this rhesus monkey. In the wild, rhesus monkeys are oftentimes terrified of snakes. Okay? So the question is snake phobia innate, instinctual, where you don't have to naturally, you see something that looks like a snake, you naturally jump back? Or think about this. We're very aware of eyes looking at us. If we walk by, let's say, a face that we don't at first see, when we immediately, before we're really conscious of it, we get very conscious of it. Okay, same sort of thing. So, wild rhesus monkeys, these guys down here, are terrified of snakes. Why? Do they learn to fear snakes, or are they innately afraid of snakes? Well, it turns out, this is an old experiment. They were raising rhesus monkeys in a lab to do some psychology experiments, and they wanted to determine what was going on, whether it was innate fear, because fear is a big deal in animals, okay? It's a big deal in us. A lot of things, like fearful things that make us afraid, we don't have to be conscious of it. We just, the minute, let's say, a monster comes in the room, we're suddenly on edge. Okay, so they raised these monkeys that had never been in the wild, and they had never seen a snake. So wild monkeys, they're afraid of snakes. These naive monkeys, they were bred and they were raised from being little, and if you show them a snake or put them close, they're not freaked out at all. Well, that's kind of weird. Now, what they did was they set up a video system where in the foreground they would put a snake, and in the background were all these wild monkeys. And when wild monkeys looked at snakes, they go crazy, right? So what they did was, the naive monkeys, the ones that had never been around snakes, weren't afraid. But naive monkeys that see wild monkeys going fearful over snakes, they quickly learn to fear snakes. So it looks like perhaps these monkeys are actually innately afraid, but they can't be. I mean, no, these monkeys are actually they learn to be afraid. So it's not innate, it's a learned behavior. Another thing is old naive monkeys that were always in captivity, and they're old instead of young, they never learn to fear snakes. Okay? It appears to be a critical period where the young monkeys have to be exposed at a certain time period, kind of like with birds. There's a critical period when the birds learn their song from their father. If they don't learn it during that period, they never do. Okay? Now, then what they did with these monkeys, and the same thing all by the way with language, and our visual system. We actually train our visual system. If you don't remember it, when you're a little baby, we have a hard time focusing, but we're actually training our visual system to start picking up things. But we learn language the same way. There's a critical period from the time we're born, maybe even while we're in the womb, and then slowly we acquire language, and usually babies and infants and young kids up to a couple of years old acquire language very, very quickly. But usually adults don't. It seems like our acquisition, learning new languages, diminishes with age. Okay. Similar, so then this video stuff, they thought, okay, looks like the monkeys are learning from these other monkeys to be afraid of snakes. So they showed these young, naive monkeys a video. They showed the young monkeys a video of old monkeys going crazy, but instead of having a snake in the foreground, it was a flower. Now, monkeys will never normally, ever, even learn to be afraid of flowers. In fact, these naive monkeys, when they see older monkeys going crazy and showing fear to flowers, they look like, what the fuck's wrong with these crazy monkeys? Excuse the language. Okay? And then finally what they did was they did the same thing again, but instead of a snake, they put in like a rubber hose that looked somewhat like a snake, and they got a response. So no response to the flower, some response to the rubber hose, and then to a real snake, real response. So it's part innate and part deception. Animals, in terms of behavior, oftentimes deceive or try to deceive one another. So these anglerfish, they have a lure that looks like it's and they stay very still, and the fish coming up doesn't really notice. All they know is this lure, this part of this anglerfish is moving around. They go to try to eat it, and the anglerfish eats them. Sometimes a male, so here we have bluegill. Here's a territorial male, a big male. The female is blue and smaller. And then this other fish right here, this is actually a male mimicking a female. Why? Well, instead of trying to get big and fight this territorial male, the female mimic can act like a female, get close to the female. When she lays her eggs, he actually releases his eggs because the female, doesn't even know, thinks he's just a sister or whatever. And then another good example are fireflies. There's a female species of firefly that flashes the same way as another species, and the male comes into the female and instead gets eaten. Okay. And then finally, there's all this stuff with the orientation, navigation, and migration. As you know, a lot of things migrate. A lot of birds do. Animals use echolocation and sonar. So these bats are using echolocation. Dolphins use sonar, high-pitched squeal. Birds have different ways of measuring where the sun is to know which way they're flying. All kinds of things like that. Okay. And then finally, in terms of community, that means the community, all the organisms in that community, let's say like a forest, sometimes communities change over time. So in forest communities, or more complex terrestrial communities, or marine communities, sometimes you get a disturbance, let's say like a fire that burns everything down. There's something called succession, where certain species colonize this new opportunity. So there are different species of plants. Let's say an even better example was Mount St. Helens when it blew its top. Sterilized the whole mountain. All the vegetation was burned off and killed and buried. Soon, there were seeds blown in and plants started to grow. And then over time, there's more and more plants, and they actually facilitate other plants by shading some plants so the sunlight is too bright. And then finally, secondary succession, after a disturbance like the loss of a keystone species like wolves, the community starts to change. So here's an example of primary succession. Stage 1, bare sand, on Lake Michigan. Bare sand is the first thing is colonized by dune building grasses. So first you're going to have the shoreline. There's no plants there, but a little inland there's going to be some grasses. Older sand dunes, more and more grasses. Stage 2, pines start to invade. 50 to 100 years after the dunes are stabilized by the grasses. Otherwise, if they're not, they can never establish. And then, finally, dominant species like black oak usually don't start appearing until later, and then they start to kind of outcompete the pines. And then finally, climax communities of black oak have lasted up to 12,000 years. Obviously, these trees aren't that old, but in this location, since the last ice age, there's been black oak that have established a dominant climax community. So, secondary succession. A large fire destroyed a portion in 1988 of lodgepole pine forest. Burned everything to the ground. In some areas, in the back here, you can see areas where there's still trees that survive. First, there were not lodgepole pine trees, coming in, but other trees that grow faster and other plants that grow faster. Lots of wildflowers came up very quickly. In fact, so oftentimes in mature forests with like, don't do that, like here, you don't get as many wildflowers because they get shaded out. But here, when they come in, all of a sudden there's lots of sunlight, wildflowers, the seeds might have been in the ground for a long time, and then suddenly there's all this sunlight and stuff, and they start germinating, and the whole thing gets covered in wildflowers and grasses and all kinds of things. And then finally, lodgepole pine, something that was originally there, there's seedlings from seeds that were dropped earlier, okay, that have been incorporated into the soil. They start to grow. After maybe 50 years, you end up with a climax